You feel behind, not just academically behind in a way that's genuinely hard to put into words. Like everyone else figured out something about learning that you missed, and now you're moving through information without any of it actually sticking. You read things and forget them within hours. You watch videos, take notes, maybe even highlight entire textbooks, and still feel like you understand nothing at a level that matters. Like you're collecting the shapes of ideas without ever grasping the substance underneath. And the worst part isn't the confusion. It's that you've tried to fix it. You've reorganized your study setup, sworn off your phone, built new schedules. You've watched videos about studying better. You've read about reading better. And here you are, watching another video, hoping this one will finally say the thing that makes it click. I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. The reason none of that worked isn't because you haven't found the right system yet. It's because systems aren't actually the problem. Here's what's really going on. The human brain did not evolve to absorb information on command. It evolved to learn things it needed, things that were emotionally charged, socially connected, or immediately useful. When something mattered, the brain remembered it with almost no effort. When something felt arbitrary, disconnected, or threatening, the brain resisted it with equally little effort. That's not a personal flaw. That's the architecture you're working with, and no amount of productivity tweaking changes the underlying structure. Most advice about self-education skips this entirely. It goes straight to systems: read this many pages a day, use these note-taking templates, build these habits. And people try those systems genuinely, with real intention, and they work for about 2 weeks. Then life happens, or motivation dips, or the topic gets harder, and the system collapses because it was never built on a foundation that accounts for how the brain actually decides what's worth holding on to. Willpower doesn't change architecture. Scheduling doesn't either. What changes architecture is changing the emotional signal the brain associates with learning. And almost nobody teaches this, because it sounds too soft. It sounds like an excuse not to just sit down and grind. But the research is consistent. When learning feels like threat, the brain suppresses it. When learning feels like curiosity, the brain accelerates it. That difference isn't motivational, it's neurochemical. And you can learn to tip it in your favor. This is why some people seem to absorb information effortlessly, while others with equal or greater intelligence struggle constantly. It's rarely about raw cognitive capacity. It's almost always about whether they've found a way of learning that works with the brain's reward system instead of fighting it. The people who are genuinely dangerously self-educated, the ones who teach themselves entire disciplines outside school, who read voraciously and remember what they read, who seem to understand things at a depth that takes others years, they're not smarter. They're running a different process, and that process is learnable. But before the steps, I need to explain the exact mechanism keeping you stuck. Because if you don't understand it, every piece of advice I give you will feel like just another thing to try and eventually abandon. The mechanism is called approach avoidance conflict. Your brain wants the outcome of learning, the competence, the confidence, the feeling of actually understanding something deeply, but it has also learned to associate the process of getting there with stress, boredom, or the specific discomfort of feeling stupid. So every time you sit down to engage with difficult material, two systems fire simultaneously. One pulls you toward it, the other pushes you away. When those forces are roughly equal, you freeze. You open the tab, you close it, you open it again. You read 2 paragraphs, lose the thread, and drift towards something that requires no cognitive effort at all. That's not laziness. That's your nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do: protect you from something it has coded as aversive. The problem is it coded learning as aversive, probably because of years of schooling that tied understanding to evaluation, comparison, and the very specific unpleasantness of being judged and found lacking. You can't undo that by deciding to be more disciplined. You undo it by slowly, consistently changing what the experience of learning feels like until the approach signal outweighs the avoidance signal, and the friction shrinks to something manageable. Here's how. Step 1. Stop starting with content and start starting with questions. Most people open a book or a video and immediately try to receive information. The brain in passive reception mode is genuinely bad at retaining things, because there's no hook, no prediction it's trying to confirm, no gap it's trying to close. Information without a question attached moves through working memory and mostly evaporates. You finish the chapter, close the book, and 20 minutes later can barely reconstruct the main argument. Not because you weren't paying attention, because the brain had no reason to flag any of it as important. Before you open anything, before you press play, before you turn the page, write down one thing you genuinely want to know about this topic. Not what you're supposed to learn, not what the curriculum demands, What do you actually want to understand? What would make this feel less like homework and more like getting an answer to something you've been wondering about? The psychological mechanism here is approach motivation. When the brain is chasing a question it generated itself, dopamine flows into the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for attention, encoding, and decision-making. This isn't a metaphor. Research on intrinsic motivation consistently shows that self-generated questions produce better recall than externally assigned reading goals, even when the total material covered is identical. The question is what makes the information feel personal, which is what makes it stick. One question. Write it before you open anything. Then find the answer to just that one question. Not the whole chapter, not the complete topic, just that. Once you have it, the next question surfaces naturally. That's how curiosity compounds without effort. Here's what this looks like in practice. Say you're trying to learn about the stock market. Don't open Investopedia and start reading about what stocks are. Instead, write, why did GameStop stock price go insane in 2021, and what does that actually tell me about how markets work? Now go find that answer. You'll learn about short selling, market sentiment, retail investor coordination, and the psychology of speculation, all of it stuck to a real event that had stakes and drama. You'll remember far more from that one afternoon than from 3 weeks of reading chapters in the correct order. Step 2. Break the passive reading loop with forced explanation. Most people consume content in long, uninterrupted stretches. This feels productive. It produces almost no durable learning. Working memory has a hard capacity limit, roughly 4 to 7 distinct chunks of new information at once, and once it's saturated, new information starts displacing old information before it gets encoded. The result is the strange experience of reading something, understanding it in the moment, and then having it completely gone by the next day. The fix is to stop every 10 to 15 minutes and explain what you just learned out loud. Not to notes, out loud to yourself, to a pet, to the empty room. This is called the protégé effect, and the mechanism is precise. The act of explaining forces working memory to actively reorganize raw input into a structure the brain can store. You can't explain something coherently without deciding what the main point is, what supports it, and what's peripheral. That sorting process is what moves information from short-term retention into long-term memory. The more important part of this is when the explanation breaks down. When you try to explain something and realize mid-sentence that you actually can't, that you understood the words on the page, but not what they meant, that failure is not embarrassing. It's the most valuable data point in your learning session. The gap between what you thought you understood and what you can actually articulate is exactly where real comprehension lives. Go back to the source specifically for that gap, not to reread the whole thing. Targeted rereading of a specific point of confusion produces 10 times the retention of reading the whole section again from the start. Set a timer, 10 to 15 minutes, then pause and explain. It will feel slow at first. Within a few weeks, you'll notice that you actually remember what you read, which is a genuinely strange and unfamiliar feeling if you've spent years consuming and forgetting. Step 3. Read laterally before you read deeply. The instinct is to pick one source, a book, a course, a channel, go deep on it, finish it, then move to the next thing. That feels rigorous. It's actually one of the most common traps in self-education, because when you learn from a single source, you don't build understanding, you build a replica of how that one person thinks about the topic. You can reproduce their framing and their examples. But the moment someone asks you something the source didn't cover, or approaches the same idea from a different angle, you have nowhere to go. You've memorized a script, not learned a subject. Reading laterally means getting 2 or 3 different explanations of the same concept before you go deep on any of them. A textbook chapter, a YouTube video by someone with a completely different background, a Reddit thread where someone asked a confused question and got 3 contradictory answers, a podcast where 2 people who genuinely disagree about the topic argue it through. What you're building is what cognitive scientists call a flexible mental model, a representation of the idea that isn't locked to any single framing and can handle pressure from unexpected angles. The mechanism is interleaving. The brain builds stronger, more transferable knowledge when it's forced to actively distinguish between slightly different versions of the same concept than when it masters one version in isolation. The confusion you feel when 2 sources describe the same thing differently is not a sign you're doing it wrong. That friction is the mechanism. That's the feeling of your brain being forced to actually think rather than just copy. This is also why people who are deeply self-educated often seem to have an unusual ability to explain things clearly to someone with no background in the subject. They can do it because they've encountered so many different framings that they've naturally found the simplest, most durable version of the idea. That ability isn't a gift, it's what happens after you've read the same concept explained 6 different ways. Step 4. Build a question log, not a note archive. Most people take notes that are copies of the source highlights, summaries, key terms, maybe some diagrams. These feel productive to create and are nearly useless to revisit. Reading your own summary of a chapter produces almost no additional learning because your brain already knows what's in it. There's no retrieval challenge, no cognitive work required. Replace your note archive with a question log. After every learning session, write 3 questions the session raised but didn't fully answer. Not questions you're supposed to know the answer to, questions you actually now have because of what you just encountered. What surprised you? What didn't quite fit with something you thought you already understood? What would you need to know to go one level deeper than what you just covered? These questions become the agenda for your next session. You're not starting from zero, you're following a thread you laid yourself over weeks and months. This creates something no course or textbook can give you. A personal intellectual map of a subject, built from your own curiosity rather than someone else's curriculum. The questions also reveal, with uncomfortable accuracy, where your understanding is real and where it's just familiarity with vocabulary. If you can't generate a genuine question about something, there's a decent chance you don't actually understand it well enough to know what's still unclear. This also solves the most common logistical problem in self-education, not knowing what to study next. The question log always has the answer. Step 5. Write to think, not to record. There's a version of writing notes that is transcription. You hear something, you write it down so you don't lose it. And there's a version of writing that is actual thinking. You write in order to discover what you believe, to work through confusion, to connect something new to something you already knew, to find the places where your understanding holds up under pressure and the places where it quietly falls apart. The second kind produces real comprehension. The first produces a document you'll never look at again. Once a week, write for 15 to 20 minutes about something you've been learning, not a summary, but an honest attempt to reason through it. What do you now believe about this topic that you didn't before? What's still confusing you? And can you pinpoint the exact source of that confusion? Is there something from a completely different area, something from your life, another subject, a conversation you had that connects to what you're learning in a way that wasn't obvious at first? This kind of writing activates elaborative interrogation, a process where the brain doesn't just store information but generates explanations for it, which produces significantly more durable memory traces than passive review. More than that, it forces you to notice when your understanding is surface level, because surface understanding collapses the moment you try to reason from it rather than just recall it. You can summarize something that you barely understand. You cannot reason from it without the gaps becoming visible. 15 to 20 minutes. Once a week. No audience. No required format. Just you, working out what you actually think about what you've been learning. Step 6. Teach something before you feel ready. This is where most self-educators stall. They wait until they know enough to explain something well before they try to explain it at all. That threshold never arrives, because knowing enough to explain something well is a product of explaining it, not a prerequisite for it. Find a way to teach something about the topic you're learning as soon as possible. You don't need an audience. You can record a 2-minute voice note to yourself explaining a concept you just covered. You can write a short message to a friend who's vaguely interested in the subject. You can answer a question on Reddit or in a Discord server, making clear you're still learning. You can explain it to a family member who will nod politely and go back to watching television. The audience is almost irrelevant. What matters is the act of translating your understanding for someone else, which forces a different kind of processing than reading or note-taking. Teaching requires you to anticipate confusion, to find analogies, to decide what matters and what's a detail. Every question you try to answer, whether from a real person or an imagined one, reveals something you hadn't fully worked out. The research on this is consistent. People who teach as they learn retain significantly more and develop more flexible understanding than people who study for an equal amount of time without teaching. The interval doesn't have to be long. A 2-minute voice memo after every session where you explain the one most important thing you just learned is enough to produce measurable differences in retention over weeks. Now I need to tell you about something that will happen, because if I don't warn you, it will stop you right when things were about to get good. Around day 3 or 4 of doing any of this, maybe sooner, maybe after a week, something will shift. The initial pull of curiosity fades. The topic starts feeling harder than it did at the beginning. Things that seemed clear will go murky. You'll pick up a source that's slightly more advanced than where you started, and you'll feel the specific, demoralizing sensation of realizing you understood less than you thought you did. This is the point where almost everyone stops. They read the difficulty as a sign they chose the wrong topic, or that they're fundamentally not a person who can do this, or that they need a better system. None of that is what's happening. What's actually happening is called desirable difficulty. Your brain has moved past the easy surface layer and is doing the harder work of building real, durable understanding. The confusion is the mechanism working correctly, not evidence that it's broken. The feeling is real. The interpretation is wrong. What to do at this moment? Don't quit the subject, shorten the session. If an hour feels impossible, do 20 minutes. If 20 minutes feels like too much, do 10. The goal during the resistance period is not to produce a lot of learning in any single session. The goal is to not break the chain. Showing up for 10 minutes every day during the hard stretch does more than grinding for 3 hours on the days you feel like it and disappearing for 2 weeks on the days you don't. Tell yourself this when it gets hard. Confusion is what the edge of understanding feels like. You're not lost. You're at the frontier of what you currently know. That's exactly where you're supposed to be. Here's what you can do right now, before this video ends, with no setup and no materials. Think of one thing you've been vaguely curious about, something that floated through your mind at some point, and you thought, I should actually learn about that, and then never did. Open YouTube, search for it, watch 3 minutes, just 3. Pause it, say one sentence out loud about what surprised you. Write one question it raised that it didn't answer. You just ran the entire process in miniature. Approach motivation activated. Protégé effect applied. Question log started. 3 steps, under 5 minutes. Nothing to install, or organize, or maintain. The people who end up genuinely, dangerously self-educated don't have better willpower than you. They don't have more time. They don't have a superior system. What they have is a different relationship with not knowing. They've learned to feel confusion as curiosity rather than threat, to read a hard concept as a puzzle worth solving rather than evidence of a gap in themselves. That shift doesn't happen all at once, but it also doesn't require you to become a different kind of person. It requires you to follow one honest question today, and then follow where that question leads tomorrow. Your education has never actually been about what school gave you. It's about what you choose to chase when no one's grading you for it. That's where the dangerous kind of self-education lives, in the space between what you're supposed to know and what you actually want to understand. Go find a question that makes you a little nervous to answer, not because it's hard, because the answer might actually change something about how you see the world. That nervousness is the signal. That's where you start.